Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and I realized recently that it has been a very long time, like a year, since we've talked about this series, and I decided it was time to rectify that. So this week, we're going to be talking about Deathblow number 4. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in April of 1994, we can see a fantastic Jim Lee cover right up on the front. This issue also features issue number 4 of Cybernary, and while I do really like this cover, I do have to poke a little bit of fun at the absurdly long rifle round ammo belt that Deathblow is wearing on the cover, especially given the fact that he has no rifle in his possession. He's instead using 2 magazine-fed pistols. Why does he have this absurd ammo belt? Because it looks cool. Who cares if it makes sense? Deathblow credits. Story: Brandon Choi, Jim Lee. Art: Tim Sale. Colors: Joe Chiodo. Letters: Tom Klein. Cybernary credits. Story: Brandon Choi, Jim Lee, and Steve Gerber. Script: Steve Gerber. Art: Nick Manabat. Colors: Joe Chiodo. Art assist: Richard Johnson. Letters: Chris Eliopoulos. The story begins back at IO headquarters, where we see Jack Lynch giving a full mission brief to his boss Kraven. Now keep in mind, this story is happening in 1994, which happens before all of the events of Gen 13, which led to Jack Lynch abandoning his post in IO and going on the run with the kids from Gen 13 as their mentor. If you'd like to know more about that, you can check out everything that happens there in my Gen 13 playlist. Jack goes down the list explaining to Kraven all of the precautions that they've taken and that Kray's team, aka Deathblow, will be basically wiped out if they get captured. Essentially, Kray's team is supposed to go in, get a bunch of information about the Iraqis' military positions. This is, of course, happening all during the Persian Gulf War of the early 90s. And he's then supposed to get out with his team, allowing for the military to then do a covert strike and wipe out the building that they were in. However, if they're captured, they're going to be blown away anyway by a set of Tomahawk cruise missiles that are fired from some ships in the Persian Gulf. Kraven is very happy about all of the precautions that Lynch has taken, and Lynch even says, yeah, it's going to be a hot time in the Old Town tonight. And I believe that this, of course, is a reference to the line stated by Jack Nicholson in the movie Batman from 1989. I could be wrong, but it seems like that's the likely case. We're then teleported to the Persian Gulf, where we see Deathblow and his team jump out of a plane and parachute into their target. Deathblow references his watch, which is actually a GPS locator, and he states to the rest of the team that the GPS is showing that they are on the correct path for the roughly 6-mile glide that they have to get to their target. Interestingly enough, the GPS lingo and acronym has to be explained in this book. As we see down here in the corner, it says GPS star Global Positioning System. Now, it's important to remember that in 1994, GPS was not something that we all had access to in our pockets, so they did actually have to explain what that was for people. Meanwhile, down on the ground, we see a group of men walking towards the palace of the Supreme Leader, aka Saddam Hussein. One of these men, however, is a Catholic monk, and he seems rather out of place, but he's being led by 2 imams who are very much in line with working with him, as they all seem very worried about the prophecy of the Black Angel. They are forced to leave their guards at the doorway, and the 2 imams are not too happy about this, but the monk tells them that they don't have time to waste arguing and that they have to see the Supreme Leader. He then goes inside and shakes hands with Saddam and is actually on rather friendly terms with him. Saddam welcomes him and asks, exactly what he needs, and he'll try to work with him in any way that he can. And the monk explains the dire situation and the belief that he has that they have to address a very real problem that is happening on the outskirts of Saddam's territory. The monk then explains that a very powerful sect within the Catholic Church known as the Order of the Cross had set up a monastery many centuries ago on the very edge of Saddam's border, and that the church would greatly appreciate this site being declared a demilitarized zone. Also, it's important to look at this ring with the insignia on it that the monk is wearing, as this will play in later. Saddam tells him that while he wants to work with the church, and he actually has no qualms about doing so, that his first priority is always going to be the security of his nation. He then tells the monk, though, that he's happy to report that some of his men were in that area earlier and that there was nothing going on, except that they did run into some guerrilla fighters and that 2 of his men were killed. This, of course, shocks the monk, who then states, "Oh my goodness, blood has already been shed. We have to act at once and get to this location." However, at this point, a radio transmission comes in warning them of American aircraft, and then suddenly there's an explosion and all of the lights go out. A generator then comes on, and Saddam states that they've prepared for just this type of situation, but the monk is actually quite worried, as he should be, because at that moment, Deathblow and his team burst through a window with all of their guns blazing. Deathblow thinks to himself that they don't have to worry about any hostages, as this is strictly a kill mission, and they just unload on all of the soldiers below. He then thinks to himself, this is what my team does best. Then Deathblow realizes that Saddam Hussein is in fact here, and he decides to take the opportunity to eliminate him. He unloads several shots into Saddam's head and watches him fall dead to the floor. He then turns around and notices something very out of place, this being the Catholic monk, who has no reason to be there as far as he's aware. He's also stunned to see that the monk is an absolute powerhouse as he lunges forward and immediately kills one of Deathblow's men by using the completely made up martial arts technique of hitting him and shoving his nose bone up into his brain. This was a widely believed urban myth back in the 90s that we just all took for granted, that this was a kill shot maneuver that some skilled martial artist could do, probably because of the fact that it was propagated by a bunch of people who didn't know dick about martial arts, and we didn't have smartphones in our pockets to just instantly research things the moment we heard them. So we just all walked around believing that there were skilled martial artists who could one-shot kill anyone around them whenever they chose to do so. The monk continues his assault, taking out one soldier after another, even using one of their bodies as a human shield as he grabs the man's gun and returns fire. At this point, Cray states that he believes that it almost seems that this man was trained by Delta Force. As Travis, one of the other men on his team, tries to figure out what's going on, he is surprised when he realizes that he lost track of his ammo count and his gun is empty. At this point, the monk realizes that he has the upper hand and is about to eliminate Travis when he is shot from behind by none other than Deathblow as he takes several shots through the chest. Deathblow tells Travis to quit screwing around and that they have to finish this mission immediately. As Deathblow approaches the monk, he realizes that he was in fact an actual priest from the Vatican. This shocks him as he thinks to himself, what have I done? I've killed a priest. Of course, Deathblow is wrestling with his own mortality at this moment, as he does have an inoperable brain tumor and believes that he is quickly approaching the end of his life and worries about what that means for his eternal soul. The priest, however, uses his dying breath to inform Cray that the prophecy in question is already taking place and that Cray must stop the Black Angel at any cost. As he reaches up towards his face, Cray sees the insignia on his ring and seems to recognize it. Meanwhile, the rest of Cray's team is going about their duties on the mission, as one man is using a camera to go around and confirm all of the kills, and the other man is faxing information back to the Pentagon, which is hilarious. Not because he's using a fax machine, but because we did not see any of these men rappel into this room with a fax machine attached to their chest. So this means that they went to all the trouble of planning this mission, getting themselves way into enemy territory, putting their lives at risk, and all under the guise of, gee, there's probably going to be a fax machine there that we can use to send all this information back to the Pentagon. I sure hope so, fingers crossed. One of the men then goes and looks at Saddam Hussein and realizes that this is a man wearing a mask and is clearly one of Saddam's body doubles. He's disappointed as he believed they were going to get a big bonus after this mission for eliminating Saddam, and that's now out of the question. At this point, Cray gets up after hearing what the monk's warning was and asks if they've decided to do anything about the second location on the map. This, of course, is the location of the monastery that the priest was talking about earlier, and Travis says no, it seemed unimportant. However, Cray tells him that he needs to inform the Pentagon that this is actually a Scud missile site and that they need to destroy it. The men then attach themselves to their zip lines and use motors on their belt to get themselves back up out of the room. It's at this point that the Imam's bodyguards finally make their way back to the room, responding to all the gunfire and finding that everyone is dead on the floor. However, they have no time to mourn their comrades, as one of them states, "We can't do anything to save these men, however, we have to complete the mission." As he looks at the location of the monastery known as Purgatory, he states, "We have to get there and stop the Black Angel." Meanwhile, outside of the facility, we see that Cray's team has put up a balloon and are all locking themselves into it. This is because their extraction plan is to have the balloon get grabbed by this bomber as it latches hold with a hook and then just pulls them all away. Cray even states that the only thing more dangerous than jumping out of a plane at 30,000 feet is getting extracted from a mission using this method, as if you make any mistakes, you're going to wind up a splat on the pavement. It's at this point a B-2 bomber makes its way across the city and drops its payload on the facility that the men were just in, and Cray is almost worried for a moment that they're not far away enough to prevent them from being incinerated by the heat that is expelled by the blast. Meanwhile, on the USS Wisconsin, they have received the orders to destroy the secondary site and they launch their missiles. At this point, Death's Angel, who is now fully awakened, realizes that they have to escape immediately, as he even seems to know that Michael Cray is the one responsible for having these missiles launched at his location. He and his cohorts make their way out of the monastery right as it's being destroyed, and we see the three of them standing above the destroyed monastery, talking about what their next move should be, as Death's Angel states that they're going to turn the entire world into a carnal wasteland. At this point, Cray's men look down at the explosion on the secondary site and think to themselves, wow, that was one heck of a blast. It must have destroyed everything that was down there. However, Cray seems to be very uncertain of this, as we see that this is the end of the story and it's to be continued. Also, what the hell kind of design is this for Death's Angel? Are we really supposed to believe that this guy and the two dudes with him who have been imprisoned in this monastery for centuries, as it's being explained in this story, all woke up and were like, yeah, let's throw on our weird bondage gear and these trench coats and dress up like goth heartthrobs who are going to go out and take over the world? Why on earth would this be their outfit? Where did they get these clothes from? It's completely ridiculous. It's never explained. And I gotta admit, I find it hilarious, but also awesome at the same time. 90s comics are the best, man. I gotta tell you, this kind of ridiculousness is just far and wide throughout that entire decade, dude. We then get an advertisement for Jim Lee's Wildcats, the animated series on CBS, which lasted for exactly one season. And we then get an ad for what will be, on the next page, a Deathblow pinup by Tim Sale. And this is actually a really cool pinup by Tim Sale. Obviously, it's just Deathblow in some sort of factory or something, but it looks super cool. And I really appreciate the fact that the guys at Wildstorm had the forethought to put their pinups in the middle of the book, and that the back sides of the pinups were just advertisements, so that if you did want to actually remove this from the book, you could do so without destroying the actual story pages of the book. That's good looking out by the guys at Wildstorm, and I appreciate it. We then find a 2-page ad for Wetworks. This is actually a really cool 2-page vertical pinup. This comic, of course, would be releasing in July of 1994. If you'd like to know more about it, you can find all of my videos on Wetworks in my Wetworks playlist. We then reach the second half of the story. the Cybernary. Again, I'm not certain as to why it continued to be referred to as the Cybernary in the middle of the book, but only as Cybernary on the titles. That never changed throughout the first 4 issues here, and it just seems really odd. Getting back into the story, it picks up exactly where we left off, where the small cybernetic dwarf scientist known as Delacorte has been cybernetically linked to the memory banks of the captured droid, as the scientists were trying to figure out exactly what her programming was and what led her to where she was captured and how she was able to fight so well. However, something happened that threw him into a somewhat comatose and almost delusional unconscious state, and his body is very much in a state of complete overdrive right now, as one of the scientists mentions that his pulse is 117 and that his blood pressure is 250/93, meaning that he is very much on the verge of dying, as they inject him with different serums, desperately trying to keep that from happening so that they can figure out what exactly was going on with this droid, not so much because they care about his actual well-being. We are then teleported to the docks, where the gang known as the Natural Born Killers have been completely caught off guard by a surprise attack from the Gamoran guard that work for Kaiser Gamora. The Natural Born Killers are trying their best to fight back using the weapons that they got from the convoy. However, being caught off guard in this manner meant that they were just not prepared for this type of onslaught and are being cut to ribbons. Meanwhile, Cisco and Katrina, the two responsible for stealing the weapons convoy that had a tracking device in it which led all of the Gamoran forces to the docks, are doing their best in an effort to try and escape the carnage. Cisco jumps onto the back of one of the Gamorans, placing a small remote grenade on the top of his head, which explodes in a sea of viscera and guts. Pretty graphic and violent for this comic, to be honest. We then see that Katrina jumps on top of another one, stabbing him through the heart, and then turns and fires a shot, blowing off the arm of a second guard, and tells Cisco that they have to work together if they're going to get out of this alive. Also, one thing that seems a little weird is if the entire weapons convoy thing was a setup so that the Gamorans could find out where the hideout of the Natural Born Killers was, why would it then have actual live weapons in it that could be used against them? Wouldn't they be unloaded or dummies or just not there at all, and it would be just an empty weapon or an empty truck that was driving along as bait? It just seems really weird that they would be like, yeah, here's a whole truckload of weapons, hope they don't use them against us. That'd be really crappy, right? One of the hunter killers then takes notice of the heroic actions of both Cisco and Katrina and realizes that the two of them are a bit different from the rest of the pack. He then instructs the two other Gamorans with him that he wants to take the two of them alive and sell them to someone named Vandelea, who will pay handsomely for them. As Katrina makes her way to the window, she turns back and yells at Cisco to hurry up and stop hot-dogging. Cisco flips the bird to the Gamorans and says, yeah, I'm coming. Katrina jumps out of the window into the water, and as Cisco's about to follow, he is actually too late and struck in the shoulder by a tranquilizer dart. The dart acts immediately, and Cisco loses consciousness, falling back inside of the warehouse. Meanwhile, outside, as Katrina breaks the surface of the water, she realizes that Cisco isn't with her and swims back to the dock. She gets up to the top of the dock just in time to see that they have loaded Cisco back into the convoy and are making their way back to base. At this point, Katrina states that it's been fun working with you, Cisco, but where you're going, no one follows and lives. And she gets on top of her bike and prepares to leave, but then realizes that she's just kidding herself and immediately starts to follow the convoy in hopes of rescuing Cisco. Later, we see that Katrina has made her way all the way to the Gamoran headquarters, the home of Kaiser Gamora. Now, we know this to be the case because it's being narrated by none other than Delacorte, and that's because he's seeing all of this happen in the memories of the droid he's connected to, because that droid is in fact Katrina. He's actually shocked that Katrina would do such a thing as follow them all the way to the city and infiltrate it, and he can't believe that she would ever fathom trying to trespass this deep into enemy territory. As she makes her way inside, she sees the convoy which left with Cisco parked outside of a hospital and believes that's the best place to start looking. As she makes her way into the hospital, she finally comes across an operating room where she looks down and sees that Cisco is on a table being dissected by two Gamoran cyborgs. As Katrina sees this, she jumps into the operating room and is immediately attacked by the attending nurse, who tells her that she is contaminating this room and is not authorized to be here. As the nurse lunges forward with two surgical implements trying to kill Katrina, Katrina dodges out of the way and cuts both of the nurse's hands off before she turns her pistol on the nurse and blasts her through the chest, killing her instantly. This alarms Dr. Vandalia, who shouts out Amelia. However, Katrina kind of just treats him with pure contempt, stating, "You name them, huh? Kind of sentimental for a cyber slug, don't you think?" As the doctor tries to back away, he states, "Yeah, well, I can defend myself, don't come any closer." However, Katrina doesn't buy it as she lunges forward and puts her sword to his head, stating, "Go on, I dare you, I'd love to plunge this sword through your brain." However, at this point, she is interrupted by a familiar voice when she turns to see that Cisco is calling out to her, begging for her help. And Katrina can't believe that he's still alive. Dr. Vandalia tells her, "Oh yes, he's very much still alive, and if that's all you care about is saving him, I can do that. In fact, I can even restore him completely to his unmodified self if that's really what you want." But he then tells Katrina that it's going to cost her dearly if she wants him to do this. Vandalia then goes on to explain to Katrina that if she wants to save Cisco, she'll have to take his place. Katrina's not sure if she's willing to do this, but Vandalia explains to her that he is the only one now who can save her friend, and that the two of them were never going to make their escape anyway, given that the moment she broke in, it sounded an alarm which alerted an entire security detail to their location. He then leads in and grabs her by the face and says, "Don't worry, my dear, I can do wonders for you." We then see an image of Delacorte being split in half by a sword. However, this is just happening in his mind, as both he and Katrina are convulsing in the lab. At this point, the other scientists decide that the only way to protect Katrina is to sever the link. And we then see Delacorte fall, but they're also kind of shocked as he's always managed to beat every level of programming that they've ever run into. But Delacorte explains to them that this has been because they weren't facing programming, they were facing an actual human consciousness. One of the other scientists raises his glasses and decides that they're going to have to investigate further to decipher if there is in fact a real human consciousness inside of this droid before they proceed with any more plans, as we see the story is to be continued. Unfortunately, it's not really for the most part, and I'll explain that in a few moments. We then reached Death Threats, the reader letter column where people could submit their letters to have them published and responded to within the pages of Deathblow. Most of these letters aren't really that intriguing, though there was one that kind of hit me as being relatively depressing, knowing where all of these things worked out later on. But basically, this reader wrote in to talk about how much he thought Nick Manabat's artwork was amazing, and how it looked as though his art would be something that you would see in heavy metal, and it was super cool to see it in the pages of a comic book, and that they couldn't wait to see more of his artwork and where the Cybernary story went. Unfortunately, it doesn't really go anywhere. There are a few more issues of Cybernary that come out at later dates, but they do not feature the artwork of Nick Manabat because this issue was being published at right about the time Nick Manabat found out that he had Hodgkin's disease. He would go on to lose his battle with cancer a few months after this issue came out, roughly about a year or so, a little bit less. Now, I do believe that I mistakenly said in earlier episodes about Deathblow that Nick Manabat died right around the time that the first issue of Cybernary / Deathblow was being published. I read that online somewhere. It's completely false. That is not correct. He was diagnosed with cancer right around the time this issue came out, and then he later died in 1995. And it's really unfortunate. I really like Nick Manabat's artwork. It does look like something that would be perfectly at home in the pages of Heavy Metal Magazine. And it's sad that someone as talented as he was and as young as he was died when he did, right as he was getting to a point of really getting some notoriety in his career. And it's unfortunate because we as readers were kind of robbed of seeing, what he could do and where he would go. And he, of course, was robbed of his life. His family was robbed of a loved one. Cancer sucks, man. And sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And it takes out people that are very important to you, people that you care about. I know I've had family members deal with it, and it just really blows that 30 years later, it's still a real problem for a lot of people. And we still haven't come up with a way to, 100% cure anyone who gets cancer up until this point. And I can only hope one day that does become the case so that stories like this don't have to happen again. And that was Deathblow #4. Overall, it's a great comic book. It sucks that, it's also tied into such a tragic event with Nick Manabat, being diagnosed with the disease that would ultimately lead to the end of his short life. And it does kind of have a dark cloud that sits over this issue. Deathblow would go on for quite some time, and it would have multiple different artists, but mostly remained a pretty good comic book. And it just sucks that for the few more issues of Cybernary that we do get, I don't believe any of them feature the artwork of Nick Manabat, as he basically spent the last year of his life in the hospital fighting cancer, trying to get it to go into remission. This, of course, never happened as he ultimately lost his battle with the disease. And it sucks, man, because Cybernary was so unique in the Image universe of the early days of Image, especially. And it was unique almost up into a fault, because I really struggle to see how the long-term tie-in between the story of the fictitious nation of Gamora would have worked with the rest of the Wildstorm universe and the greater Image universe. It's not that it was impossible to tie it in. In fact, there are mentions of Gamora in other Wildstorm titles of this era, but it does seem like it's something that feels outside of the bounds of the rest of the Image universe and doesn't really tie in super easily. Not that they couldn't have done it. I feel like it could have happened, but it would have required a lot of real effort to do that and make it seem really seamless and flowing like so much of the rest of the Wildstorm universe seemed to do, especially with Lynch crossing over to so many different titles. But then again, these are all just my opinions. You may think that Cybernary would have been really easy to tie into everything had it continued for any length of time. You may have not cared for the stories that were in this issue and thought that they weren't very intriguing. But if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.